Final Rule, HM-215P. My name is Stephen Andrews. I'm with the Office of Hazardous Material Standards and Rulemaking Branch. I am more specifically with the Regulatory Review and Reinvention Branch within the Standards and Rulemaking Division, and I worked on developing this final rule. Logan, did you have something? Did you need to say something?
No, sorry about that.
Oh, okay, all good. And today we'll be talking about the HM-215 final rule. So in this presentation, some of the things I'm going to be discussing will be key benefits of the amendments in the HM-215P final rule. By the way, can people hear me okay? Somebody said they can't hear me. Can most people hear me? A couple of people tell me.
Loud and clear, Stephen.
All right, thank you, Stephen. So yeah, some of the things we talked about in this presentation include the key benefits of the amendments in the HM-215P final rule. We'll give some background on our harmonization rulemakings and how they're developed. We'll talk about what is the need for harmonization, and then we'll go into some of the amendments themselves to the HMR in this final rule. Next slide, please. So first off, some key benefits of the amendments in the HM-215P final rule is kind of a broad look at the rulemaking itself. Later in the presentation, I'll go over the more specific amendments, but I first want to go over broadly what are the major benefits of this final rule. First off, they help the HMR maintain alignment with the international standards, such as the United Nations Model Regulations, the International Maritime Dangerous Goods Code, or IMDG Code, and the International Civil Aviation Organization Technical Instructions, which is like KOTI, which of course is the regulations by air. The UN model regulations are discussed, debated, and voted on in Geneva, Switzerland. Our International Standards Coordinator, Dwayne Fund, is the chair of the UN Subcommittee of Experts on the Transport of Dangerous Goods. And we also try to align with changes to the IMDG code. Those meetings are held in London at the IMO. Steve Webb at International Standards represents us there. And finally, like I mentioned before, there's the IKOTI, which establishes regulations for the safe transportation of hazardous materials by air. Also within some of the key amendments in this final rule relate to changes to the HMR related to lithium batteries. Specifically, we'll talk about a few of the changes that align the HMR and accommodate increased volumes of lithium batteries by way of providing additional latitude for marking sizes, exceptions for certain lithium batteries that remain during use in transport, and various stowage requirements on vessels. We'll also discuss multiple amendments related to the COVID-19 emergency. This final rule does include amendments that codify provisions that facilitate the transport of COVID pharmaceuticals and vaccines. And of course, one of the main benefits of international harmonization is reducing regulatory obstacles to the safe transportation of hazmat by avoiding in-transit interruptions and reroutings that result in release and/or exposure. So, the Federal Hazardous Materials Transportation Law does direct firms that participate in the relevant international standard settings bodies that I previously mentioned. The Federal Hazmat Law also encourage us to harmonize with the domestic and international regulations. However, the Federal Hazmat Law does permit FEMSA to depart from international standards where appropriate, whether that be for safety reasons or some other overriding public interest. And the majority of the time, I believe we do harmonize, but there are those cases where we make the case that we do not want to harmonize with some specific amendment. Overall, this rulemaking minimizes regulatory conflicts pertaining to the transport of important goods that happen to be hazardous materials. Next slide. And just to let you guys know, I have Candace Casey's with Standards and Rulemaking in chat if you have need some quick clarification. But once I'm done with the slides, we can do the more formal questions and answers. I just want to make sure we get through these slides before we start going into a more formal questions and answer session. So yeah, the background on these harmonization rules, the HM-215 rulemakings amend the HMR to maintain alignment with international regulation standards when appropriate. Like I mentioned before, there are some cases where we do not harmonize. As I mentioned previously, we participate in the development of the international regulations and standards that the amendments in this final rule harmonize with, such as The UN model regulations, which serve as a regulatory framework for the IMDG code and the KOTI. Again, we evaluate each of these international standards or amendments on its own merit. As previously mentioned, there are cases where we choose not to harmonize with an international standard, hence the when appropriate I mentioned earlier. The amendments in this final rule reflect the biennial updates of the UN model regulations, the IMDG code, and the ICAO technical instructions. Consideration of the proposals and amendments takes place in several rounds. First is the development of the UN papers and policies prior to the participation in the UN meetings. Then there are the actual meetings themselves where the discussions and voting take place. And then there's the NPRM process that we do at PHMSA that gives you guys in the regulated community the ability to comment on the rule and make a case where we should or should not incorporate a specific international amendment. This final rule serves as the public notice of our intent to modify the HMR, which we have done every 2 years since 1994. And that started with the original HM-215 rulemaking, and now we're up to, this is the HM-215P, and we're currently developing the HM-215Q rule. Next slide, please. So what are the needs for harmonization? Why is harmonization good? Well, harmonization ensures that HMR is informed by the latest best practices and lessons learned. For example, one way this is assured is by our incorporation of updated consensus standards like those published by the ISO, which is the International Organization for the Development of Standards. The ISO is an international body, and that is an international non-government organization, and it's made up of various national standards bodies. And it publishes a wide variety of proprietary, industrial, and commercial standards. And within these international rulemakings, we'll typically incorporate several of those standards that are related to hazmat transportation. Harmonization also improves the understanding of our requirements. Typically, a good number of the amendments are editorial clarifications, and I'll be highlighting some of those later in the overview of amendments. But probably the most important part of harmonization is facilitating the smooth flow of hazardous materials to their point of origin. One of the main objectives of harmonization rules is to provide this regulatory certainty and avoid dual and potential conflicting regulations, which could cause delays in shipments of hazardous materials internationally. So obviously we want to be able to move things from point A to point B across the globe with as few roadblocks as possible. And lastly, harmonization helps us have consistency emergency response procedures. It is important to have consistency in hazardous communication requirements such as marking and labeling. This facilitates the goal of clear and reliable emergency response actions in the event of a hazmat incident. The revisions in this harmonization rule aid in the understanding what is required to respond to a specific hazmat release, and it makes it easier to comply with the regulations when a hazmat release event occurs. Next slide. So now we're going to go into some of the different amendments within the HM-215 final rule. First one, we're talking about battery markings. And we made an amendment to the minimum size marking for lithium battery marks. Prior to this final rule, the lithium battery marking could only be as small as 120 by 100 millimeters high. In this final rule, we amended the lithium battery size marking in 173-185C to permit the lithium battery mark to be reduced by 100 by 100 millimeters. Additionally, this amendment allows for packages that are too small to display the 100 by 100 millimeter mark to further reduce the marking size to 100 by 70 meters. And this is an important revision that, more and more you're seeing more consumer electronics getting smaller and smaller. They contain lithium batteries, and this allows people like the Amazons of the world to transport these things in smaller packages where they can fit and put a smaller lithium battery mark on them. Second bullet here is on organ preservation units. We wanted to highlight a lithium battery related amendment pertaining to these units, which are basically a big battery powered cooler that are used to transport organs on aircraft for transplants. So to maintain consistency with ICAO technical instructions by air, and obviously prevent the further frustration of organ shipments, PHMSA amended the provisions for organ preservation units to be allowed to be powered by lithium batteries, both metal and ion. Previously, I believe they were powered by non-spillable batteries. So this is just an increase in change in technology that we've made an accommodation for. Next slide. Exceptions for lithium batteries and equipment. So this bullet is essentially about the data logger provisions in 173.14. So we added a new section 173.3.14 to provide exceptions for equipment that contain lithium batteries that remain in use during transport. Items that will be covered under this section include battery-powered cargo tracking devices or data loggers, which continue to become more frequently used as shipping logistics become more sophisticated. And essentially what these things are small devices, powered by lithium batteries. They might slap on the side of a pallet, and the company that ships it can track the movement of that pallet, through the logistics chain and make sure it reaches its destination. Second item I have on here is on with respect to 173.14, we did receive comments on the section. The NPRM folks were concerned that 173.14 may have inadvertently pulled in other types of always-on devices that are being shipped as cargo, things like hearing aids and other electronic devices, whether it be medical or consumer related. We did make a clarification in the final rule that this section does only apply to these trackers, and it does not apply to items with a hazardous material that are being transported as part of a consignment, so products themselves. We specifically called out that the products that are being shipped are not subject to 173.14. Next, damaged and defective batteries. The final rule added a new paragraph in 173.185I4 that requires the shipment of lithium batteries that are offered into transportation for the purpose of disposal or recycling or offered under the damage and defective provisions of 173.185F. They must indicate on the shipping paper that it is the shipment of damaged and defective batteries. And we've seen more and more issues with damaged and defective batteries, and it just gives that awareness to people, emergency responders, that on the shipping paper that what they are seeing in that shipment are damaged and defective batteries. And for that purpose, acceptable notations include damaged, defective, lithium batteries for disposal, or lithium batteries for recycling. We also added stowage code 156 to the lithium battery entry UN 3090 and UN 3091 and UN 3480 and 3481. This will cause lithium batteries that are offered in transportation for disposal or recycling by vessel that are offered under the damaged, defective, recall provisions to be stowed in accordance with stowage category C. And stowage category C does require on-deck only stowage on cargo and passenger vessels. So, these things will be more readily accessible in case of an emergency were to happen with them. Next slide. So as I mentioned before, talk about some of the COVID-19 related amendments in the HM-215P Final Rule. First off, we added provisions for alcohol-based sanitizers. Specifically, these amendments were designed to facilitate passenger safe travel by air. The provisions match what was already in the ICAO technical instructions, which allow alcohol-based sanitizers to be carried aboard aircraft by the operator for the purpose of passenger and crew hygiene. The intent of this amendment was to ensure that air operators can equip with alcohol-based sanitizers for use in the cabin without the regulatory burden of documentation and packaging that will otherwise be associated with the transport of Class 3 flammable liquids. Next is the allows acceptance of TDG emergency certificates. So the TDG emergency certificates are transportation of dangerous good emergency certificates. Those are issued by Transport Canada. And essentially, in Canada, those act as what we use as special permits in the United States. So we finalized a reciprocal agreement with Transport Canada to recognize their temporary emergency certificates for shipments made into the United States. And this, this helped certainly during COVID-19 and moving various products back and forth between the US and Canada. As I mentioned before, we added those provisions for data loggers. I mentioned that again because the data loggers were actually very important in the transportation of the COVID-19 vaccines. It was kind of one of the big usages of them. Those vaccines had a lot of value and were extremely important. So the pharmaceutical companies were able to track those vaccines to make sure they got from point A to point B. Lastly, permitting Division 2.2 aerosols with no subsidiary hazard on aircraft. So as part of these COVID-19 related amendments, we expanded the list of items that passengers, crew members, and operators may bring as a carry-on in a passenger aircraft to include 2.2 aerosols. So these are the non-flammable gases only. Currently, these items were limited to checked baggage. However, before this rule, they were limited to checked baggage. However, this amendment allowed passengers and crew to board the aircraft with items like sanitizing sprays for their personal use in flight. Next. So discuss some various packaging related amendments in the HM-215P Final Rule. First, it was there's the composite multi-elemental gas containers, or MEGCs. These MEGCs are essentially bundles of large interconnected cylinders. This amendment added provisions to expand the construction material of MEGCs beyond stainless steel, for which they are now typically constructed. Cylinders of this size used for MEGCs have been permitted to be made of composite materials before. However, the language pertaining specifically to MEGCs and HMR had not been amended in the past, so this amendment corrected that oversight. Polymeric beads and molding compounds. We made an amendment that provided uniformity in the packaging requirements for these. We amended the materials to be transported in combination packages rather than limited to single packagings. Generally, combination packagings are authorized whenever single packaging are. So this seemed to be more of a regulatory oversight than anything, and we made this change, which also conformed to the 2021-22 ICAO technical instructions. Lastly, on this slide, we amended the minimum wall thickness requirements for small IBCs. Those with a capacity of 5. The minimum wall thickness is a prescriptive construction requirement that middle IBCs are subject to on top of the numerous performance testing requirements like stacking and leak-proof testing. And at the UN, it was agreed that having both a thickness and performance-based requirement was unnecessary, duplicative, and limiting items of product design and limited to product design and innovation. So by removing the prescriptive construction requirements, such as saying that these things had to be a certain millimeter thick, we just say now that the design has to be able to pass all the performance-based testing, which should provide for greater flexibility without compromising safety, provided they can pass all the tests that they normally would. Next slide. So this starts getting into some of those sort of editorial changes that I was discussing earlier. And these are going to be changes to the hazardous materials table and various special provisions. The final rule added 3 new hazardous materials table entries for detonators. So the new UN numbers were added for 3 new UN numbers were added electronic detonators. Adding these additional entries allow these items to be distinguished from their less advanced counterpart electric detonators. So there's a difference between electronic detonators and electric detonators. Well, this primarily affects the proper shipping name that appears in the EX approval. This is becoming increasingly more significant as international shippers have begun using these UN numbers and proper shipping names. Additionally, we are adding a new hazardous materials table entry for UN 3549 medical waste category A. This is for consistency with the ICAO and the UN model regulations. Now, we did receive some comments from the NPRM on why we did not include the packaging provisions as well with this proposal. But we believe it was important to maintain control over the packaging of these materials due to the unique nature of any future pathogen we may face and the unique threats they may face. And while we're not adding a specific packaging provision for these items, we will be able to approve packaging and transfer the materials through an emergency special permit. And we have done this in the past. And we've been able to approve these things in a quick 2 or 3 day time frame. Excuse me, it's a long word here. Okay, so also we're removing the prohibition to ship UN 2216 stabilized fish meal or scrap by air. Before this final rule, when classified under this constant entry, stabilized fish meal and scrap was only authorized for transportation by vessel or highway. With this amendment, shipments of this item by air will be subject to quantity limitations and will have to meet certain levels of chemical stabilization, but it will be allowed by air. And then lastly, we're making a few editorial changes with the intention of clarifying the regulatory text. For example, special provision 47 deals with sealed packets and articles. Within the special provision, we previously made reference to small inner packaging. We clarified this to say these materials must be in sealed packets and articles. UN 3363, there's an update of a proper shipping name. The UN model regulations contain the entry UN 3363, dangerous goods and articles. We revised that proper shipping name to align with UN model regulations. The SAPT and SADT definitions. So these are the definitions for self-accelerating polymerization or decomposition temperatures, respectively. We modify these definitions in 171.8 to be more user-friendly. Currently, instead of the definition section in 171.8 providing a usable explanation, it simply spells out the abbreviation and directs the user to another section of the HMR. We've included a definition there. Next slide. So we also assign Special Provision 387 to the hazardous materials entry UN 2522. This provides additional instructions for hazardous materials stabilized by chemical or temperature controls to ensure a level of stabilization prior to transportation sufficient to prevent the material from dangerous polymerization. We removed special provisions TP 39 and 41 from the HMR. These are no longer used, and there was a transition period for the continued use of those certain portable tanks, and that transition period expired. We assigned stowage code 52, which requires stowage separate from acids to several entries in the HMT. These are entries that are in a group of chemicals called alcoholates. Segregation from acids was previously not required by the HMR for these materials. We added stowage code 157 to column B for numerous entries in the hazardous materials table. Stowage code 157 requires aerosols, small receptacles containing gas or gas cartridges, transported for the purpose of recycling or disposal to be stored again with stowage category C, which again requires on-deck only storage and be clear living quarters. And lastly, Special Provision 360 requires that vehicles only powered by lithium batteries must be assigned UN identification UN 3171. And so here's some, these are various amendments related to inspections, closures, and packagings. The first item, periodic inspection period for chemicals under pressure. This amendment is consistent with the new special packing provision PP 97 added in the 21st revised edition of the UN model regulations. And it says you must provide a test period of 10 years for tubes and cylinders that have a capacity of 450 liters or less and are filled with fire extinguishing agents. There's a change to the limited quantity mark on one side of a package by air. The requirement was extended to markings to ensure visibility and communication hazards to the greatest extent possible. This is consistent with what is required by the ICAO technical instructions, and we added a new paragraph in 172.315B3 to require that for air transport, the entire limited quantity mark must appear on one side of the package, so it can't be folded over to different sides. You have to have the whole thing on the side. With regards to Pi-Mark cylinder, section 171.23, we did revise that section to update to reference the most recent version of the ADR, the European regulations, the 2021 version. And lastly, the stability of nitrocellulose products. We added special provisions intended to ensure nitrocellulose products are tested to verify they meet specific stability requirements to avoid the danger of self-ignition during transportation. And yeah, that's it. So guidelines for testing chemicals. This specific slide is about the testing that's required under the HMR for determining if you have a corrosive material. We updated the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development's guidelines for the testing of chemicals, including test number 431, which is an in vitro skin corrosion test. And the impact of this test will require less reliance on animal testing. The updated edition includes in vitro methods, which are non-live animal methods that allow for better differentiation between hazard categories, which wasn't possible in earlier editions. So it's now really possible under this under the standard to do both your Class A classification and determine what packing group you have with your Class A material. So this should help the agency move away from less of the live animal testing being required. Excellent. And lastly here, I just have a list of the various international standards that were updated as part of this final rule and what version we're on now. Obviously, we're now on the 2021-22 ICAO technical instruction. We're at 4020 of the IMDG code, the 21st edition of the UN model regulations, the 7th edition of the UN manual of testing criteria, the latest version of the international standards, like the latest ISO documents that I talked about earlier, and the most recent version of the radioactive materials regulations, the SSR-6. And overall, we expected this rulemaking that result in about $23.5 to $28.5 million a year in cost saving to the regulated community. And that's, I believe, what I got. And we'd be happy to have people put up some hands and ask some questions now. I have some other members of the international team, I believe, here as well that can also assist. Anybody there? Any questions? Anybody else want to say anything or?
Yeah, I don't see any questions in the chat. Got a thank you from David Albrand. More thank yous. No questions.
Thank you. Sounds good. Yeah.
Can we get a copy of the slides sent to us?
Yeah, that would be fine. I think I can if I attach it to this, I think you guys will be able to access. If not, you can feel free to email me if I can't get it that way. My email is steven.andrews@dot.gov. And I'll be happy to provide you a copy of that.
Somebody has a question about holding times, the requirement to indicate the holding time on the shipping paper in 203. What's your question, Kyle? Do you want to put it in the chat or do you want to?
Yeah, if you could let us know what you mean specifically.
Wait for Kyle to respond.
How can you access the voice or no?
Yeah, did I get it there?
Yeah, there you go.
Okay, hey, so I ship liquid oxygen, and they're in vessels that are less than 1,000 pounds. And I saw on here that there was a holding time requirement to the shipping papers. Does that sound familiar?
Yep.
Okay. All of my portable tanks are under 1,000 pounds. So the way I'm reading it, will I need to put a holding time on my hazmat manifest moving forward or shipping papers, or am I all right because they're under 1,000 pounds?
I don't think that there was any, Steve, you can chime in here, but we didn't put any sort of limit on the size of the tank. It was just that if it wasn't a portable tank, it needed to be indicated.
So any portable liquid gas tank needs to have a holding time on it. Because I've
Yes.
never seen a holding time on any of our vessels ever. This is completely new to me. So I was just trying to figure out where I would go about finding those and how to do it properly so I'm in compliance.
Yeah, I mean, that change came directly from the UN, and there was not any sort of limit on the size or, unfortunately, a whole lot of guidance on how to calculate that, the holding time. So I don't know if Steve, you have any insight onto how to calculate that or what the idea was. I mean, it was just there for, emergency response alerts.
Yeah, because the way our cryogenic liquid oxygen works is they have pressure relief devices on them that keep them from getting over, say, 200 psi. So basically, as the pressure rises, they'll vent off pressure to keep it under 200. And that can vary. If it's a hot day like today, I mean, the tank may vent off in a day or two. But if it's cold and in the winter, it could vent off over, the course of a week. I mean, they will eventually all vent off, but that period of time can vary drastically depending on external temperature.
Yeah, there are some good day, everybody. There's a reference in the paragraph Q there that talks about the calculation method, and it must be calculated in accordance with 178.338-9. I don't
Yep.
have that open, but it gives you sort of the calculation method at least. And Candace is right. It's the requirement is for portable tanks, which would then take you back to the definition of a portable tank from 171.8, which is bulk packaging except a cylinder having a water capacity of 1,000 pounds or less. So there is I guess a nuance there for something that's not considered a portable tank by the definition. But
Yeah, because all of ours, they weigh like 500 or 600 pounds is what they weigh when we're shipping them.
right, I'm a little unclear if that's still considered a portable tank per the definition, or if it falls under the cylinder exception.
Yeah, and that was kind of my question, because I would think it wouldn't be classified as a portable tank just because of the size of it, but I don't want to be hauling stuff and be racking up violations either.
I would, and Steve, tell me if I'm out of line, or Steve Andrews or Steve Webb. I would say that would make a good interp question that we could answer probably by letter of interpretation. We're always happy to receive a unique question, so I would say send it in and we can see if we can get you a better answer.
Yeah, who should I send that into?
I will put the email address for you in the chat. Is that okay?
Yeah, that's great. I appreciate your guys' help.
Yeah, any other, Bridget? Bridget have a question?
Hi, yeah, thank
Yeah.
you so much for this presentation. I'm Bridget Rogers. I'm with PETA. I really don't have a question, just a comment. I just wanted to say it's so exciting that y'all have completely accepted that in vitro skin test number 431 for the Class 8 classification, because it really should make the use of the animal corrosion test absolutely obsolete. So I really hope that companies are going to use the in vitro method moving forward, and that PHMSA is going to encourage the use of that test in place of it. So thank you so much again for this presentation.
No problem. There are no other questions. I can let everybody go. Thank you, everybody, for coming. Thank you, Candace and Steve Webb, for helping out. Yeah.
Thank you guys all. I